String theory, heralded as a potential theory of everything, has been dominant in theoretical physics for 30 years, with more scientific papers arising from it than any other theory. But critics argue the theory has held undue influence, and it is an error to pursue it. String theory proposes 11 dimensions and a vast landscape of possible universes without any evidence. Moreover, a theory of everything has not been forthcoming, and predictions of supersymmetry have not been confirmed. Is it time to move on from string theory and recognize that the search for supersymmetry has failed, and seek alternative accounts of the universe that are supported by observation and experiment? More fundamentally, should we see mathematics without a connection to the physical world as little more than fantasy? Or is the continued dominance of string theory justified by its potential to unify our understanding of the universe once and for all? So, on to our speakers. Roger Penrose is a world-renowned mathematician and Nobel laureate in physics. He is best known for his work on general relativity and sharing the Wolf Prize for Physics with Stephen Hawking for his work on black holes. Eric Weinstein is an American podcast host, managing director of Thiel Capital, and a doctor of mathematical physics. Brian Greene, on the screen here, is a professor of mathematics and physics at the University of Columbia. He's famous for his groundbreaking discoveries in superstring theory. Tasnim Bain is a theoretical physicist, writer, educator, and author of Only the Longest Threads. We're first going to start off with Roger, who's going to tell us about his kind of 3-minute pitch on whether it's time to move on from the dominance of string theory in our account of the universe.
Well, I wasn't sure it was still dominant. But still, when I first heard about it, in I guess the early 1980s, I found it a very exciting idea. It looks as though you could use these sort of, well, these surfaces, Riemann surfaces, as a replacement for things like Feynman diagrams in talking about quantum field theory. And it looked very like an exciting idea to me. But then it rapidly became, well, at least the story was, and I didn't understand it well enough to see why it had to be like this, that it only worked originally in 26 dimensions. So it meant that space had 25 dimensions and time had 1 dimension. My reaction was, okay, well, that's the end of it as far as I'm concerned, because space doesn't have that many dimensions. Of course, I understood that the idea somehow that several of these dimensions are tied up into little knots and things like this, but it just never struck me that this worked, because, well, the argument was somehow you could never excite the degrees of freedom which are involved in these tiny little extra dimensions. It just didn't seem to me that was correct, because even though it would take a lot of energy to excite these degrees of freedom, that amount of energy was as far as the whole universe was concerned. I mean, you don't just do it locally, it would affect the whole universe. And the amount of energy that here, over the whole universe, which amounts to, say, a Planck scale energy, which is the sort of thing they were talking about, is ridiculously small. So I didn't see why this would, why you wouldn't be notice that the number of space dimensions was wrong. I just never took it seriously for that reason. But then it became very much an in thing, and so I had to pay some attention to it and make critical remarks, which are probably too naive, I expect, in my various books. But I've never been a fan of the idea. As I say, initially I thought it was a very beautiful idea, but since it seemed to require all these unreasonable extra degrees of freedom, it's not just extra dimensions, there's all this stuff which you can't get hold of and doesn't affect the physics. So it didn't make too much sense to me, I'm afraid.
Okay, thank you. Next, Brian Greene. Is it time to move on from the dominance of string theory in our account of the universe?
Happy to say a few words on it. Again, apologies that I couldn't join you in person. It looks like a wonderful gathering. I would suggest at the outset that the framing of the question suggests a radically incomplete understanding of how science actually works. I mean, I'm happy to engage in these kinds of discussions. I think they can be illuminating for the general public and they're enjoyable to have, so I have nothing against them. But the idea that we would sit here and pronounce how science should or should not move on from this or that idea misses the point of how science actually works. science is an endeavor carried out by scientists who generally have an enormous amount of training, an enormous amount of experience, like Roger and others in the discussion here. And the choice of what to work on by design is left to the individual, what they find interesting, what they find exciting. So people will continue to work on any given subject so long as it continues to bear fruit and give interesting results that inspire yet other avenues of research. And that's what's happened in string theory. And that's why people have continued to work on it. And when the theory and the ideas begin to dry up and they're no longer bearing fruit, then individuals will move on. And certainly some string theorists of the past have moved on to other ideas because they lost interest in this or that avenue of research. And they do other things. And that I applaud. That's a wonderful way in which science can be rich and self-propelling in order that the endeavor of trying to understand the universe will continue. When it comes to string theory itself, where have we gotten? I think that's a conversation that we will continue to pursue in our discussion here. But briefly put in 30 seconds, string theory is the most potent and powerful approach that we have discovered as a species for blending general relativity and quantum mechanics. And putting these two pillars of scientific understanding together is vital to understand things like black holes and the Big Bang. And indeed, string theory has made its greatest mark in understanding black holes. So is it something that is worthy of pursuit? I think the answer is yes. Obviously, thousands of others around the world think the answer is yes, but it's not for us to pronounce. It's for the marketplace of ideas to decide, and scientists will vote with the most precious resource they have, which is their time. And so as long as scientists think that it's worthwhile to work on string theory, they will. And when they don't think it's worthwhile, they won't. That's about it.
Thanks very much, Brian. Tasnim.
So I find myself in complete agreement. I feel like I'm almost taking up where Brian left off, in the sense that I do think science is a self-correcting mechanism. And especially for theoretical physics, when all you're doing is, you're sitting down and writing these equations and thinking about things in your head, it's very hard to put that kind of work into something if there's no pull in it for you. So there has to be something that appeals to you. And to that point, I just want to say that one of the criticisms that leveled at string theory is that it was supposed to be the theory of everything, and it hasn't turned out to be that. And it's had 40 years, and it's not. We don't have this one coherent theory of everything. To which I say, it's been 40 years, and the theory is still talking to us. It's very hard to explain what it feels like when you're doing math and the equations are talking to you. The closest I can get to it is saying it's like you wrote the theory, you wrote the equations, but they have consequences that seem to have an intelligence of their own. It's like if you programmed a computer, you would expect it to do calculations much faster than you, much more efficiently than you, which is probably why you built it. But you don't expect it to have this innate intelligence that is different to yours. The thing with string theory is that we may have misinterpreted in the beginning how much work was required, but the theory is still telling us things. Yes, it's been 4 decades, but it's built a lot in that time. It's a very robust, consistent mathematical framework. And I think it's very easy to underestimate what a feat that is, because something this huge and just structurally coherent, it doesn't collapse in on itself, that in itself is something worth looking at. And string theory has led to many new ideas along the way. Sometimes I feel like we criticize it because it's still called string theory, but that may just be an accident of history. I mean, it's not a theory of only strings anymore. Is it a theory if it doesn't have testable predictions? But then again, we call atoms, right? We know they're not indivisible. So maybe it's just called that as a historical accident. But whatever this framework is that's developing, it's giving us a lot still. It's telling us a lot of things. And while the equations are still talking to you, I think it's very hard to stop listening. And I don't see why we should.
Thank you very much. Eric.
So rather depressingly, I very much agree with Brian, because it is a marketplace of ideas, at least in theory. And as long as there are equations and ideas and people who wish to explore them, the ideal of the scientific community is that we should do exactly that. And the problem is that that is not exactly how science works. And in particular, this ignores the entire political economy of science, which has to do with jobs, claims, public relations, and effectively diverting the resources of the community, which are never particularly generous after the Cold War era, towards string theory. And it's not just a question of, let's say, delivering better pizzas, but also slashing the tires of the opposing pizza parlor. And so the real problem is that we keep talking about what we're comfortable with, which is the nature of the ideas. What I'd like to do is I'd like to use most of the 3 minutes for debate. So I'm just going to say one thing about this. String theorists often say that's not how science works. And the concern about string theory is that string theory works like no other science. And so the biggest complaint that many of us have is that string theory sets itself up as the judges and referees who's winning, who's losing, what's the best leading theory, and finding themselves virtuous in almost all contests. So it's like playing a team of referees who may not necessarily be better footballers, but tend to find that they always win the game. So let's save the time for debate, and let's get into it.
Thank you very much. So it's often said that mathematics is the language of physics, but physics also answers to experiment. How do we balance these two different factors? There's kind of the way the mathematics leads us and the way that we find things out through experiment. Roger?
Well, I think the trouble with string theory is that there isn't any connection with observations. As far as I'm probably taking too strong a view here, but the mathematics, I mean, it's largely driven by the mathematics as far as I know, which is in itself is not an objection as far as I'm concerned. A lot of what I do is driven by the mathematics. But the trouble with string theory is it's supposed to be a theory of the way the world operates. And if the number of dimensions of space is just wrong, I can't take it seriously. And I mean, there are arguments why all these extra dimensions are hidden, and I don't think those arguments are right either. So I'm just left in a position where the problem is not so much, how much mathematics or how much physics or what. We're not talking about things which can be experimentally tested anyway, as far as I can see. If you could have a theory which had predictions, and these predictions could be seen to be right or wrong, that's what I understand about physics. But string theory seems to me driven largely by certain ideas which have importance in mathematics, but sort of irrelevant to the physics, really. As far as I know, there's places where string theory has had an impact on mathematics. Sure, it has, but it's not physics, as far as I can see. So the main trouble I have with string theory is I don't think it's physics.
Does anybody want to defend the idea that string theory is in fact physics, not mathematics? Brian, go ahead.
Okay. So I appreciate your remarks, Roger. Obviously, I have a different perspective on it. One, when it comes to the fact that various formulations of string theory do require extra dimensions, that's, of course, a long-standing program that existed long before string theory. The whole Kaluza-Klein program dating back to the early decades of the 20th century is one that considered the possibility that our universe might actually have extra dimensions. The issue of exciting modes in the extra dimensions is one that I think we understand reasonably well, that the energy goes like 1 over the putative size of the extra dimensions. So if their size is sufficiently small, the energy that needs to be focused in a sufficiently small region to excite those modes is larger than any energy that we have access to. But if we did have that energy, we would be able to excite those modes. I have a feeling that we're not going to be able to settle that in this discussion here, but I'm not concerned. And in fact, moreover, I've spent decades thinking about those extra dimensions. So I think it's actually a very fruitful part of the theory, as opposed to something that is a detriment or something that is an embarrassment. It's a wonderful quality of the theory. In terms of whether string theory is physics, I would put forward 2 points. Number one, the whole reason why we are interested in string theory is that we believe the world is governed, at least in certain energy scales, by the general theory of relativity, giving us our theory of gravity. We believe that on sufficiently small scales, quantum mechanics shows its colors. And we believe there are realms in which general relativity and quantum mechanics need to play together. And without a theory of quantum gravity, physics is at a loss for how to proceed. And so the value of string theory in physics is that it gives us a quantum theory of gravity. That's why we're interested in it, and that's why it's part of physics. I agree fully that we don't understand the theory well enough yet to draw direct predictions for things that we can go out and measure. That's why it is a theory, very much a theory in progress. And how long will it take to extract those kinds of predictions? I don't know. I wish we had those predictions too, because if we could verify them, great. If we could prove the theory wrong, fantastic too. I, like many string theorists, think that we live once. I'm not interested in spending my time on a theory that's wrong. And so being able to make that experimental judgment would be wonderful. We can't do it yet. I agree with that, but that's not some fundamental failing of the theory. It's the failing of us theorists to understand the theory well enough to make those predictions. Final point I will make is in terms of connection to physics, and there are others that I could bring up, but let me just focus on one. We've known, Roger, of course, since the work of Stephen Hawking, about, for instance, black hole entropy. And string theory is still the only framework within which we can calculate from first principles for a certain category of black holes and reproduce the beautiful formula that Stephen Hawking wrote down in terms of the area of the event horizon divided by 4. And so there's a wonderful connection between a quality of the world that I think many of us agree is correct, that black holes have entropy governed by the area of the event horizon, and string theory's calculation from first principles for certain categories of black holes of that number. So that, again, among many other things that we could discuss, are links to physics. So I'm a little surprised that you would say there's no connection to physics, but perhaps I'll leave it there and happy to hear your response.
Tasnim, do you have anything you want to add to this topic?
Yes, and that I think we would all love to see the experimental verification. It's just a technical issue of reaching those energies. And I think there's no string theorist who would not want verification. And I don't know of any string theorist who says it's not needed. Right? We all agree that that is what we're working towards. We just think it's going to take a lot longer than usual to get there. And to that point, I just want to say, I mean, we're used to thinking that these experimental, I don't even know what to call them, devices, apparatus, I mean, something as huge as LIGO or, the colliders at CERN, we can see what goes into them, right? We see how finely they have to be calibrated. We see the amount of material they take. So it's easy for us to see how complicated they are. I just want to suggest that the reason we haven't solved all the theoretical problems is that the math is equally complex. It's just not material. You can't see it. But there's a lot of things that have to be literally as finely tuned as that LIGO laser beam. There's a lot of maths that has to be developed. There's a lot of frameworks that we need to come up with. String theory is sort of forcing us to develop all of these things. They're not pre-existing. So yes, it's taking time. And I think those of us who are motivated by it are willing to give it that time.
Eric, at the beginning, you mentioned that maybe string theory is different from other sciences. So perhaps you'd like to
Sure.
answer this.
So you actually just saw it there. I'm actually sympathetic with Brian's position more than this position of Roger's. I understand. So the theory calls for 10 dimensions. Maybe 6 of them have to get rolled up. They have a very small diameter. That means that you're going to take a lot of energy to excite it, which means that there's an energy threshold beyond which you hope that you can make predictions, but we haven't gotten there yet. That would apply to every other theory that might be a rival to string theory. But if you try to tell string theorists, hey, I have a different theory, it makes particle predictions, it says exactly what the SU3 cross SU2 cross U1 quantum numbers are, they'll say at what energy level? And you say, I don't know. And they'll say, well, then it's not a prediction. It's not, your theory is not real. And you say, well, you just pulled a maneuver much worse than that. You won't even tell me what those things are. And so you have to understand how this game is actually played. The fact is that string theorists will always tell you that if the better theory came along, that they would immediately move to it. But when you ask them about whether they've looked at their colleagues' theories, if I asked Brian, for example, how in depth have you looked at Peter White's assertion that you should start from the oddity of SU3, go back to SU4 and look at a twistor theory, which includes Wick rotation at a fundamental level? I don't think Peter White's theory is correct, but at least I've looked at it. Very often the string theorists will tell you that they have no time. So what you start to understand is that there is a very easy set of behaviors and an equanimity that the string theorists appear to have that is not realized except in the breach. So the problem that we usually confront is that this theory plays by sociological and economically different rules. If you say, for example, that there's no experimental test of string theory, yet many string theorists told us exactly where we would find relatively low energy supersymmetry at the LHC, which failed to materialize. And so you can play infinitely the energy dog ate my energy homework. The particles are never found. If you push string theorists hard enough, they will say, well, it's actually not a theory, but a framework. When I pushed Joe Polchinski of blessed memory on this point, he said, Eric, you treat string theory as if it was a theory when I think we're just running subroutines for Ed, being Ed Witten. It's a very strange game, and not at all how science is played. So I believe that Brian is making a better point than Roger, no offense, but I believe that the point is actually that you're playing keep away according to rules that always favor string theory. It's like why you don't win in Vegas. It's because the house is always taking its vig and you can't possibly win. And so the problem here is that what sounds reasonable is reasonable at the first level. But then, I would ask Brian, what do you think about my explanation for why there are 3 generations of flavor chiroparticles? I doubt you probably even know that I have an explanation, and it might be wrong. I'm not afraid of being wrong, but my feeling is I've studied your work, I've studied your books, your PBS specials, and there is no reciprocal interest because this community secretly thinks that it is smarter than the other communities. And in general, this is in fact true. I'm not arguing it. What I am claiming is that level of intelligence has been misspent. And it has been directed by a tiny number of individuals. String theory is not in some sense dominant at the moment, but the pig went through the python. In the 80s, there were a huge number of jobs. Many of us were critical at the time. I moved into mathematics to avoid this thing. And in fact, what happened is that pig is working its way through the python as an affirmative action program for boomers and silent generation academicians who are exceedingly good at mathematics, but seemingly not so good at physics. And so there is no contact with the physical world, but an infinite mathematical game is played, and it is a self-consistent mathematical framework like many frameworks. For example, Chern-Simons theory in dimension 3 is not a theory of the world, but it leads to a quantum field theory, as we found out in the late 80s. The fact that we find out that quantum field theory has nothing to do with physics. It's a framework like calculus or linear algebra that is promiscuous. It sees other people. That framework is what the string theorists have been excellent in advancing. And some of these results do not prove that it is a physical theory, but merely that it is a mathematical framework. And we should be grateful to string theorists, but we should ask them, please clarify, would you say that linear algebra and calculus are physical theories? If not, then it would appear that most of the positive results are not really theories about physics at all.
It seems only fair to call on you to respond, Brian.
Sure. So I guess I would say, first off, that, and I do, of course, remember the period you're referring to, Eric, back in the 80s. And I do feel bad that some wonderful mathematicians and physicists who were not working on string theory found it difficult to get jobs and to get postdocs. I remember talking to Peter White back in the 80s. I gave a talk at Stony Brook, and he was working on some very interesting stuff, but the jobs weren't materializing in a way that perhaps he deserved, and it wasn't happening. And the problem is it's a finite resource. I wish we would just take half of the budget from the defense departments around the world and turn those into academic jobs for physicists, mathematicians, poets, literature specialists, language. I mean, that's really where the culprit is.
Amen, Brian. But the problem is that the invective that was leveled from your community towards the other communities is the part that's ignored.
See, that's the part, Eric, that I was there, and again, I wasn't in every room, so I certainly can't claim to say that didn't happen. If you were the recipient of that kind of invective, I will apologize on the part of the community, because that's never anything that one would want to do.
You've always been the most decent of string theorists, but no. As you can see, I have no problem agreeing with Brian when he's right, and he's often right. The problem is that Brian is not representative of a community that refers to others as morons, as idiots, as wasting their time, as not really physicists, et cetera, et cetera. Ask any postdoc who passed through Stanford during its period of maximum euphoria for string theory. People come out very broken and angry. I remember David Kaplan giving an interview, David E. Kaplan, because there are two of them, where he said it took him a long time to realize that he wasn't an idiot because he couldn't understand what was being done and was being told that he was somehow mentally deficient. There was a real problem. There continues to be a real problem. Michio Kaku just said, put up or shut up. I'm not aware of Michio Kaku putting up much of anything. I've put something up, and the guy will not be quiet. I mean, at some level, this is an extremely aggressive, belligerent community, and unfortunately, we have the most kind and decent exponent of it. So I welcome any discussion with Brian Greene, because it's fantastic.
Yeah, so again, obviously, a large community of 1,000 researchers is going to have a big bell curve of those who are able to play well with others and those who don't. I've been called moron by some people in the field at various times. It's an unpleasant thing to have happen, and it isn't the way people should talk to each other. So I'm glad that we totally agree on that. Getting back to sort of the physics side of things, I wish, and I'm going to echo what we've already made reference to, but I'm saying it in a sincere way. I truly wish I had enough time to investigate the various ideas and theories that are mailed to me, sent to me, put in front of me. And the problem is it's very hard to carve out the time to investigate theory after theory after theory, especially when I don't even have time to keep up with the rapid pace of development within string theory proper itself. So let me just finish one point. It's really not that I have no interest in other ideas and other approaches. And I would say that that's pretty much true of many of my colleagues as well. The problem is it takes so much effort and time to even understand the language sometimes in which other theories are described, or to go through manuscripts of dozens, 50, 60 pages of calculations. It could take weeks and months to really get to the bottom of it. And that's really what the problem is. So what I would say is, by no means am I going to echo Michio Kaku's put up or shut up, because that's, as you said, that's not sort of my frame. But if another theory came along and did say what string theory did for our understanding of general relativity and quantum mechanics, which is where the interest came from, it solved a problem that nobody had any idea how to solve before, and it did it in an understandable and manifest way that you didn't have to work very hard to understand the progress, and you could jump in at the ground floor and run with it. If there's a way even of your theory being put forward in a way that says, here's the problem that I've solved, here's the way it's consistent with everything that's come before, here's the advance it's going to give, and all you need to do is understand these three ideas, yeah, I would be open to learning about it. And so absolutely.
Okay, so first of all, appreciate it. I appreciate the sentiment. What you're saying is that string theory solves a problem interior to quantum gravity, which really originates around 1952-53 with Bryce DeWitt. My feeling about this is, if space-time is in fact doomed, as is fashionable to say, it's not clear that the right way of harmonizing gravity and the standard model is to force gravity into submission into a quantum regime. It may be that in a post-space-time construct, harmonizing gravity rather than quantizing it is important. And what happens with the string theorists is that they very frequently say, we've come closer to a quantum theory of gravity. When you get to that point, please give us a ring. And some of us are saying, you actually haven't made the case for quantum gravity, which has been 70 years trying to ship a product and failing. Furthermore, if I said something very simple to you, which is like take a vial spinner in 14 dimensions, tensored with 0 forms, direct sum 1 forms, and pull it back to dimension 4, and you'll find 2 plus 1 versions of the families of the standard model, 2 fundamental, 1 emergent. I didn't take any of your time. I took 45 minutes to understand Peter Woit's theory. It is inconceivable that you cannot spend the 45 minutes I spend, and my guess it would only take you 20 because you're in the field day to day.
I'm going to jump in there. Tasnim, you have experience of working in the string theory community. Do you think there are any kind of institutional factors that are different in string theory than other areas of physics, or do you think it's kind of just like other areas?
So I can only speak from my own experience, and from what I can tell is that the discussion that's happening here is something that happened. I mean, people are talking about politics that was there before I was active as a graduate student. So I don't really have any personal experience of that. I went into string theory because I loved it. I mean, nobody had to coerce me. There was none of that, and nobody had to discourage me. I got to do what I wanted to do. I mean, to some extent, I can understand, saying that there are particular fashions in academia, as there are in pretty much everything. And but I do think that if you are pulled strongly enough by something else, you pursue other things. I mean, string theory itself, right? It started out in the 60s. There were only 2 people who were championing it, Schwartz and Shirk, and that was it. But the idea itself had such a momentum that eventually other people got on. So I do think that we shouldn't have one exclusive theory. I mean, there should be other explanations, and there should be vibrant communities. But when a theory has come to a point where it develops that momentum, and there are that many people who are actually really invested in the idea, I think it'll just naturally come up.
Thank you. So, Roger, we've discussed how the evidence might be slightly different from string theory, or not yet there in terms of observational evidence. What do you make of the appeal that people have to other types of evidence, such as principles that guide us, such as simplicity or naturalness or kind of mathematical beauty? Do you think these are things that can be used as evidence, or are they kind of supporting a fantasy?
I think they can be used, but I don't see it in string theory. I mean, the trouble is that they claim it's such a beautiful theory. As far as I can see, it's a great mess. I mean, you've got the wrong number of space dimensions. You've got an argument to try and argue that you don't get enough energy to excite the extra dimension. And I think that argument is wrong, actually, because the amount of energy is for the entire universe. It's not that you're building an accelerator to get up to a certain energy that's beyond the level of that accelerator. That's not the point. You've got that much energy, and all over the universe, things with a great deal of energy, and there's no reason why these shouldn't excite these extra dimensions. I think there's just a misconception in that. I don't want to go into it further, but it's a bit technical, but I think it's a misconception. I also think that string theory is not all that beautiful. It's not beautiful even as mathematics, which is part of the argument. You need all these extra dimensions, which we don't see. Well, it does nice things in mathematics. I would argue that there have been arguments which simplify certain mathematical expressions and calculate them further than had been done before using string theory arguments. That says nothing about physics. The theory, to me, is just in the wrong direction, and it's wasting a lot of time. And even the claim that you get the Hawking temperature or the Hawking entropy out of this, sure, we knew already what it was. Mm-hmm. Why does string theory, if you can do it again using string theory, it doesn't impress me very much. Mm-hmm. If you got a different answer, and somehow you could have observational evidence that different answer was correct, that would impress me. Mm-hmm. But there's nothing like that in what's been done. There's a lot of hype in the subject, I think, which I really don't go along with. And in a certain sense, there are too many theoretical physics communities which have wasted their time on this area rather than doing what I regard as more interesting topics. Even the question of quantum gravity, which has been brought up here, bringing quantum mechanics and gravitational theory together, sure, that's a very important thing to do. But quantizing gravity, in my view, okay, it's an interesting exercise, but it's not the important thing in bringing them together. The important thing together in bringing them together, in my view, is to explain why quantum theory works. See, quantum theory works for tiny little things, if you like, but when you do what's called making a measurement, or you talk about big things, it doesn't work, because there's something missing, something fundamentally missing from quantum mechanics. And what's fundamentally missing, I believe, one can give strong argument, is that features of general relativity have to be brought in. And those features indicate the level at which the collapse of the wave function comes in, and that quantum mechanics needs help, I'm saying. And it needs help because we see things which, if I take this glass and try and put it in superposition of here and there, you don't do it. It doesn't stay. It goes to one or the other. Quantum mechanics doesn't say that. Quantum mechanics is not just incomplete, as some Einstein and Schrödinger and people would say. It's not really quite correct. It's not correct because for large objects or for large displacements of objects, you don't get the answer we see in the universe. Now, to get that answer, my current belief, for quite a long time I believed, that you have to bring principles from general relativity. So the combining of those two theories, the focusing on trying to quantize gravity, I think is a mistake. Okay, it would be nice to see a theory of gravity which, at the appropriate levels, agrees with quantum mechanics. But that's not where we need help in quantum mechanics. Where we need help is in the collapse of the wave function, which is a huge thing missing from the theory. And there are arguments which suggest very strongly that you need to bring gravity in.
Right.
And that feature is not anywhere to be seen, at least not by me, in what's been done in string theory. It's just going off, to me, in the wrong direction. And it's lots of people in physics departments, theoretical physics, they're guided in this direction because lots of other people work in it.
So I wonder if our other panelists have any thoughts of whether this issue in quantum mechanics, can string theory help us with this problem? Or is string theory silent on this, or this kind of orthogonal, an extra issue, not something, string theory has its own issues separate from this?
So string theory does not at the moment answer the question of the quantum measurement problem. And I agree with Roger that that's a critical question that has faced quantum mechanics really since its inception. So I agree that there are open questions that even string theory, as it's currently formulated, doesn't address. Has Roger addressed it with his approach that aspects of general relativity will be vital to the collapse of the wave function? It's a powerful and interesting idea. I've studied it. I'm not yet convinced of it, but it is among many ideas that people working in this arena have put forward. I'm glad that people are working on this key question of quantum mechanics. But in terms of the importance of quantizing gravity, I would take a somewhat different perspective than Roger's. Quantum mechanics is an established part of the way the world works. General relativity is an established part of the way the world works. If they can't play together, if when you combine them, you get nonsensical results, which was the state of play before string theory gave us a potential solution, then your physical description of the world is fundamentally inconsistent. And I don't think the universe is inconsistent, and therefore it is vital that we find a way to put the pillars of our previous understanding into harmony with one another. Eric mentioned perhaps there are other ways of doing it. Fantastic. I'm open to those ideas, but string theory at least is one approach that does that. And it's important, it's vital, and string theory not only achieves it, but to the question of beauty, let me just put forward the following. You do quantum mechanics of a string without any knowledge of general relativity. And just through the process of studying that quantum mechanical description of a string, general relativity emerges. It's forced upon you. It comes right out of the mathematics. If Einstein hadn't discovered general relativity, string theorists studying the quantum mechanical motion of a string would have found general relativity within the formulation itself. That's beautiful. That's breathtaking. That is what pulled many of us into the field. And so these issues, sure, beauty is somewhat in the eye of the beholder, but for two theories that were at loggerheads to naturally come together where one induces the other to emerge from the formulation, that's beautiful.
Can I get on that last one?
Go ahead.
Okay. This is really weird. It's the post-diction of general relativity. Let me do general relativity for you. Take the scalar curvature and integrate it. Okay. That rediscovers general relativity in terms of taking the Euler-Lagrange equations, and it took under 5 seconds. This is not a fair way to go about things. We're now having the conversation about beauty and ugliness. A giraffe is beautiful, as is a 3-year-old child. And if I cut the head off a 3-year-old child and sew on the head of a giraffe, that is in some sense beautiful in two separate ways. If I take space-time and I put a Calabi-Yau threefold, complex threefold at every point, that has the feeling of a baby with the head of a giraffe. There's a certain way in which it's beautiful, particularly at the level of the analytics. So what I hear Roger talking about very often with twistors is a much more algebraic and geometric view. What I hear Brian talking about as beauty is the beauty of a renormalizable spin-2 field that's massless, falling out of the quantization of a string. These are different worlds. They're sewn together in a very unconvincing and ugly way. I don't want to rob Brian of the claim that there's beauty, because there's tons of beauty in the theory. There's also tons of ugliness and artificiality in the theory, as there is in general relativity, where the equations in the Lagrangian are beautiful, but the energy constraints are ugly and have a different origin and are meant to keep Einstein out of trouble. So what we have is a situation in which I feel like the audience never actually hears a debate about the underlying nature, and we stay on the surface level where we're talking about it's beautiful, it's ugly, it post-dicts, it predicts this. The real nitty-gritty of this thing is that Brian and Roger are both correct, and they're not coming to loggerheads in front of an audience for reasons that actually escape me.
Would you like to come to loggerheads now?
I didn't know we weren't. I thought we were in loggerheads. I was trying to say that all these extra dimensions are wrong, and that's fundamental to the theory. Surely that's a loggerhead if I ever thought of one. Isn't that a loggerhead?
It's a very polite loggerhead, maybe.
No, I mean, it's completely against the way that string theory has gone. I mean, originally, when I heard the idea of string theory and the space-time had the right number of dimensions, 3 space and 1 time, I thought it was a really nice idea. And it seemed to indicate that things could be finite, which would otherwise give you divergences and so on. Brings in beautiful ideas of Riemann surfaces and mathematics, which I like. I like the idea. I thought this is a great place to go. But then they decided, look, it doesn't work unless you have 26 dimensions. So I said, okay, you can work on that. I'm working on real physics. I mean, the reason that they present that these extra dimensions, you have to excite all these degrees of freedom, I think that argument is not correct. To have a theory which involves a space which has more dimensions, the number of extra parameters is infinite. I mean, it's not like adding an extra parameter in the theory. I don't want to go into it, but I don't think the argument is correct. And that there's that much energy to excite for the whole universe. I mean, if it's a few Planck energies or something, the whole universe has got lots of those. There's no reason why they shouldn't excite this one extra little bit of... Sorry, I shouldn't go into this, but I'm trying to say that I don't believe the argument is correct, that you can consider that these extra dimensions are free from being excited in current observation.
If you consider the mass of the material making up the Large Hadron Collider, there's enough energy there to excite the W and Z bosons. Why'd you have to turn the machine on to actually create them? It's a question of focusing the energy. So I don't know why we're disagreeing on this point, but clearly there'll be a...
I agree with Brian, by the way.
You keep saying that, but that doesn't answer the question.
Well, but what you're saying about 26 dimensions...
Well, it's 26 and 10 at the same time. Now,
well, for 2 different string theories. I mean...
No, you're talking about what fermionic and bosonic... and you've got... It's not consistent. The trouble is with string theory, as I understand it
Right.
now, it's not really a proper theory.
Well, they usually say eventually it's not a proper theory, it's a framework. But
That's a good way of wriggling out of it.
yeah. Well, this is how they avoid actually having to put the same constraints on themselves as they place on others. And, even in the situation where you're talking about those dimensions, because it's Lorentzian, it's really 2 less than that. So it's 24 and 8. And these are octonionic dimensions. One of 3, octonionic 3 space generates all of the large exceptional Lie groups. It's an extremely interesting idea. The fact that this doesn't work is a different argument. And what Brian is saying is true. We can't feel neutrinos in this space, thank God, because they're tearing through all of us body and soul. But the fact of the matter is that with sufficient care, we can find the world that is hidden. I think what Roger's saying, the way I interpret it, correct me because he's right here, is how come everything that we can't see that you keep talking about, you also have the right to place just outside of our Umwelt, and therefore 40 years later, it's not really 30, it's 39, 40 years almost after the anomaly cancellation, you've revved everybody up, we're super excited, and we're left with a practically North Korean level narrative of the first string revolution, the second string, then Juan found the equivalence between gauge theory and string theory, and it's like, we're waiting, and the problem is everybody's revved up, and people have lost interest in other basic theories, and people are going to move off to quantum computation and AI, and we're going to be left with digging out of this for 50 years. Why doesn't the string theory community perhaps do something before that happens, like hold a series of conferences called Strings? What went wrong? Were we listening? Who else is out there? And bring other communities in so that we don't lose the fundamental physics enterprise to Sabine Hassenfelder and her adherents.
So,
So that particular outcome would not be a pleasant one indeed. But I think that the point that's being missed here, and if there's anything that I would hope the audience would take away from our conversation that I think we've yet to at least articulate fully, these ideas of 26 dimensions and 10 dimensions and vibrating strings, they're not some random haphazard ideas that string theorists kludge together in order to satisfy some kind of mathematical fantasy. These are rigorous mathematical calculations, and I think Eric would agree with at least that description of them, which have been done with utmost care, that in the earlier version of string theory, without supersymmetry, had 26 dimensions as the absolute number that emerged from that description. You put in supersymmetry, the 26 changes via a calculation, a precise, rigorous calculation, to 10 dimensions. These are self-consistent approaches to describing the motion of a quantum vibrating string, which has the added benefit not of kludging general relativity into the story, like putting the giraffe on the 3-year-old's body, but emerges directly from the mathematical calculation. So the idea of analogizing that with looking at the integral of the scalar curvature, that's a distinct formulation of general relativity using the very tools of general relativity, curvature, 4-dimensional manifolds, and so forth.
I'm going to just jump in here.
The beauty of string theory is general relativity emerges from it without putting it in from the get-go. That's the point that distinguishes them.
Thank you, Brian. So it seems like there's a question about whether in order to find these extra dimensions, we're going to have to search, and we might find horrible things like a child's head attached to a giraffe in doing so. And the aim of doing this has been in search of a theory of everything, or a theory of quantum gravity has been the discussion of, is this the right way to go? But the question is, maybe that's not the only thing that string theory might be good for. So Tasnim, do you think there's some value to string theory aside from thinking about things such as the search for quantum gravity?
I think there's been great value in string theory because, like I said, it is a mathematical framework that is still ongoing, it's still developing. And it's telling us things, it's telling us some really interesting things, which I think both Eric and Brian kind of referred to, the duality conjecture or ADS-CFT correspondence, which is a really huge insight. I mean, this is, again, a very personal thing, as you've seen people who are very well established in the field and very intelligent can have different views on things, right? They can hold their own opinions on what pulls them, what they consider beautiful or important. To me personally, the idea of duality, I feel like if nothing else comes out of string theory, that insight in itself is huge. Because what it's telling you really is that two theories, which look completely different on the face of it, they can live in different dimensions. So one is, say, 4-dimensional, the other is 3-dimensional. You write down their equations, and there is this way in which you can just flip one into the other. So it's literally like saying that those two theories are describing the same physics. We've parameterized it differently. We've described one as a 5-dimensional theory. We've described another as a 4-dimensional theory. One is a quantum field theory. The other has gravity in it. And the theories are equivalent. To me, it also seems a little bit strange that, in some sense, string theory is saying that the concept of dimension is not as fundamental as we thought, right? A theory in 5 can be equivalent to a theory in 4. I don't know why we criticize string theory for having so many dimensions, when one of the things that might come out of the theory is the fact that the concept of dimension is itself not fundamental. Could be, an artifact of the way we are writing the theory down. So I think string theory, that's just one aspect of it, but I think string theory has given us so many new ideas, so many new constructions, and the fact that we don't have a theory of quantum gravity, to me at least, means that we don't have the right model yet for it. String theory is giving us a series of consistent models. Now, the fact is we're looking for something. You can't just go out looking for anything new, right? String theory is right there, giving you a whole bunch of new things, telling you some narratives that you would not have come up with on your own. And for that in itself, I think it's very useful. You're working with an intelligence that is either beyond or at least very different to yours. It's telling you things you would not have made up. So in that sense, I think it's worth pursuing.
Please join me in thanking our speakers.